this video we're going to be looking at sculpting up a bust and then making a mould from silicone and then casting up copies in perhaps a resin or a plastic. Now this is a sculpture that I made some time ago. It's what I called my bat dude. I'm quite bad at thinking up names for sculptures, as you can tell. Now I've been thinking about doing some busts of some of my pieces, so I thought this would be a good one to start with. I featured this in previous videos, and it's sort of a bit of an interesting sculpture for me. And when I started making it, I didn't actually intend for it to look like this at all. Originally this was going to be a sort of a scaly, sort of evil looking creature with sort of burned skin. I'd found that if you take a heat gun and use it to heat Sculpey, the Sculpey would bubble up in a kind of a scaly texture, and I thought that would be quite a good basis for creating a skin texture on a sculpture. So I decided to make a large-scale sculpture in Super Sculpey, and this is what I ended up with. Now with Super Sculpey you have to cook it in the oven to get your final piece. It hardens with heat. So what I'd planned to do was to make a large-scale sculpture and then use a heat gun to cook it, and in that process the heat gun could burn the surface of the model, give it a nice sort of textured look to it, and then I could add some additional paint to get a final texture. But while I was making this sculpture, the forms that the sculpture took just led it in a completely different direction. I ended up with a sort of perhaps a slightly angelic looking creature. And once I'd sort of got halfway through the sculpture, I realised that the sort of burnt, scaly texture that I was looking for just simply wouldn't be appropriate. So what I was left with was this large sculpture. And the problem I had was that it wouldn't actually fit in the oven. I also couldn't use my heat gun approach because I didn't want to burn the surface of the Sculpey after all. So I was left with a bit of a conundrum. But what I decided to do was eventually to build a tent on the outside of the oven made out of tin foil. The idea being that the heat would come out of the oven into the tent, and this would heat the sculpture and cook it. And this kind of worked, more or less. This is the largest sculpture I've made in Super Sculpey, and it's more or less worked, but I think you can probably notice in a few places there's some cracks appearing, and this is because the sculpture didn't entirely cure. I don't think the heat throughout the tinfoil tent that I'd created was consistent. So there are a few problems with it. Nevertheless, I really like this sculpture. It came out quite well, and it's completely different to what I actually expected it to look like. So I'm going to use Super Sculpey again. However, on this occasion I'm going to use a different type of Super Sculpey. As you can see with this piece, I used a flesh coloured Sculpey, and that's great because I wanted a lifelike sculpture. But because this is going to be a sculpture that I'm going to make a mould of, I don't need that realistic look. The other thing with the flesh Sculpey is there's a touch of translucency to it, which is obviously fantastic if you're making your sculpture and you want it to look realistic. But on this occasion I actually don't need that, and I think I'd actually prefer a clay which is opaque. The difference is that if the clay is opaque, it just allows you to see the details that you're sculpting into it a little bit easier. So what I've got here is two types of Sculpey. I've got the regular flesh coloured stuff, and I've also got this grey Sculpey firm. Now the problem with these is the grey Sculpey is quite hard, much harder than the flesh coloured Sculpey. But it's also a little bit crumbly, perhaps a little bit too difficult to work with. On the other hand, the flesh coloured Sculpey is quite pliable, quite easy to work with. So what I want to do is actually combine them together to create something that's pliable and easy to use, but it's also opaque. Now, a while back on a forum, someone told me that a good way to do this was to use a pasta maker. Previously I've done this with my fingers, and you really can knacker your hands after doing this for a while. So I bought myself a pasta maker, and what I'm going to do is shred up the two types of Sculpey and then use the rollers in the pasta maker to recombine them together. Alright, so there we go. There's my rolled out pieces of Sculpey into some quite thin layers there, and it seems to have worked quite well. So as with my previous sculpture, I'm using a stand and armature here made out of some plumbing fittings. So I've got a loop of copper wire, it's actually brake pipe, which is soldered onto some 15mm plumbing pipe. And then for a base I've got a copper disc, which I've soldered a plumbing fitting onto, and that just slots in nicely like that, and that provides a nice stable armature to do my sculpture on. Now I covered soldering in my previous video. If you want to know how that's done, then please refer to my previous video. I'll put a link in the description. So what I'm now doing is using that loop and adding some wire just wrapping that around to create the basic shape of the sculpture. So the original sculpture's obviously got some quite large ears, so what I'm doing here is just creating some basic forms to support that sculpture when I put the clay on. Right, so there's my sort of basic form there, just a couple of long lines pointing out in a V shape. What I'm now doing is taking some tin foil and just wrapping this around to get the very basic forms of the head and also of the neck and shoulders. I'm just using regular sort of household foil here. I find that the thick stuff is probably best just because it sort of fills out and stays in shape a little bit easier than the thinner stuff. So this is kind of where the sculpture begins really, just sort of getting the very basic shapes with foil, and then once we've got that in place we'll then start adding clay. The other thing I'm doing here just to sort of hold everything in place is wrapping some thin wire around it. This is just to sort of keep the foil in place, but also to give the clay something to stick to effectively, just give it a bit of a texture so it doesn't slip off. Right, so there's my sort of finished armature. As you can see, I've got some of the basic forms of the ears there, just with some tin foil and wire, and basic form of the head and the shoulders. And now I'm just continuing now to add clay, just sort of building that up, again just for very basic shapes, trying to get the proportions correct. Now, although this is a sort of a fantastical creature, it's still based upon human anatomy. So in my previous sculpting video I talked a little bit about getting the proportions of the head correct, and for this piece it's not really that different, to be honest with you. You need to get the eyes sort of in the centre of the head, so that's equally distant between the chin and the top of the head. The eyes will line up with the corners of the mouth. The nose will sort of be halfway between those two. So it's really just a question initially of adding those basic shapes, trying to get the proportions correct. So as you can see here, I've sort of got the basic shapes in place there, and it sort of looks more or less like the basic shape of the sculpture. So what I've got here is some glass eyes. Now what these are just blank eyes, and what I've done is painted some black into the back of the eye. I don't need any detail colour because this is just going to be, I'm going to be making a mould of this sculpture. So there's the eye in place, and I think that looks pretty good. It doesn't look too big. I seem to recall that the eyes I used on the original sculpture was something like 14mm, so I could go in and sort of measure this all out and try and be exact, but I tend to sort of more rely on sort of trying to get the feel of the sculpture rather than relying too heavily on precise measurements, although that's probably a better way, I suppose, of actually doing this sort of thing. I'm trying to capture the sort of the essence of the sculpture rather than making a direct replica. So as you can see, I've done some further work here, and we've got some detailing of the eyebrows above the eye there. I've also sort of blocked in some of the shape on the right hand ear there. As before, what I tend to do is concentrate on one side of the face, and then once I've got that looking the way I like, I can then replicate that over to the other side of the face. As you can see here, I'm starting working on the chest here as well. So with shoulders and chests, figures tend to work in sort of head heights. So a figure might be 8 head heights tall, and that's quite a handy proportion for sort of when you're doing a sculpture like this. So when I'm doing shoulders, I try and make sure that the shoulders are about 1 head height from the centre of the chest to the right and to the left. So as you can see, even at this stage where I've been working on this for quite a while now, I've still not really started adding in too much detail, as I'm still just slowly adding form here, and that's really just done by adding small pieces of clay, moving them around, taking some away, and slowly building it up until I sort of get the look that I want. It's only then that I can start adding in wrinkles and small details and things that really bring it to life. I must admit, it's quite difficult to sort of stop doing that. There's been many occasions where I've added tons and tons of detail and spent ages putting nice little fine wrinkles in and lots of detail, only to discover that I've got the proportions incorrect and I need to scrap it all and start again. So you do tend to save yourself a lot of work by making sure you get the form correct first before you go in and start adding too much detail. That is something slightly different from the previous sculpture. I've decided to sort of give the piece a slightly more alien looking chest. I only really did the sort of top half of the shoulders on the original sculpture, but I kind of figured that, you know, this is a creature, it's not a person, so it should have something that's sort of slightly different from standard human anatomy. So I'm sort of trying to give it some more sort of interesting rib type structures there, and maybe something that hints at some folded skin. I don't know whether this creature, if it were sculpted in full, would actually have wings or not, but you can perhaps imagine that these folds might spread out into actual or full-blown wings perhaps. The other thing I always struggle with personally is getting collarbones correct. I always seem to want to make them curved and sort of just seem to get them in the wrong position. So as with everything, using lots of reference is always a good plan, and for this I just referred to some reference photos of a elderly chap that I got from a website called 3DSK. I've mentioned that before. Why an elderly chap? Simply because he's a little bit more bony, his bone structure is a little bit more pronounced and prominent than a younger chap would be, so it's just easier to see how the bones sit and how the muscles sort of lie. If you're doing a sculpture, I'm sure it can be fun to do sort of subtle curves and that sort of thing, but I always like quite pronounced sort of anatomy, you know. If you're going to sculpt something, you may as well show people what it is you're sculpting, so that's the way I tend to lean. So as you can see here, I'm sculpting in some basic detailing, and what I'm using here is a tool that I've made myself. It's just a loop of a guitar string soldered onto the end of a bit of copper tubing, and I find that's really good for just sort of scooping out small channels in clay and sort of adding little details like that. That's really sort of the essence of doing this. You just sort of take pieces away, add pieces in to try and create detail and contours and just sort of natural lines that a creature might have. Just adding a blob of clay to the lips here. I always find with sculptures that if you get the mouth right first off, that really sort of helps the way you sort of perceive the rest of the sculpture. I think it's probably because we're so used to sort of analysing human expressions that if your sculpture's sitting there with a sort of a malformed mouth, it's sort of, I think your brain just sort of perceives it as perhaps being a deformed face, you know, and it's very difficult to sort of see how the rest of it can go. But that's my experience. So I find that if you get the mouth sort of looking halfway decent, it really helps to sort of bring the rest of the sculpture to life. Similarly with the eyes as well. Once they're in place, the sculpture really sort of starts coming to life, I suppose you would say. So I'm just sculpting some more detail here into the eyebrows. What I've actually found here is that I've sculpted down and hit some of the metal armature underneath. This is one of those things that tends to happen fairly often with sculptures, and it can be rather annoying. Yeah, you're sculpting away, take a piece of clay away to get a piece of detail you want, and suddenly there's a piece of metal sticking out. Luckily it's not too difficult to remedy, because what we've got here is a ball of foil sitting with some wire wrapped around it. There's a bit of give in the foil, so what I can do here is just press down with a sculpting tool and push the wire and the foil back into the sculpture, and then add some additional clay on top of that to hide that particular piece. So that's what I'm doing here. So here's my finished detailing the eyebrow there, and as you can see it's a bit of a mess in close-up. But what I'm going to do here is just take some white spirit and a paintbrush and just apply that to the clay. And I mentioned this in my previous sculpting video. White spirit will melt the Sculpey slightly and allow you to smooth down the detail. So as you can see here, I'm just brushing that on, and you can see that it's smoothing out some of the harder edges and just giving that a slightly more organic look. So here's where I've got to with the sculpture so far. Now, the majority of this was actually sculpted while I was on holiday down in Cornwall, so I've only recently been able to actually get the original sculpture out of storage. So I sculpted this using reference photos. So having a look at it now, I can see that I've got a few bits slightly wrong here. I think the bits where the ears meet the head are probably a bit too high on my bust. I also think maybe the head's a little bit too long, perhaps, and maybe a bit thinner. But it doesn't matter too much, because like I said, I'm not trying to make an exact copy of this sculpture. Perhaps this is another individual of the same species. I'm really just trying to capture the essence of the sculpture, and nevertheless I do want to get it a little bit closer than it is, so a little bit more sculpting to do. But this is it for part one. Part two we'll look at the rest of the sculpting. I need to make a base for it as well, which I think will also have a bit of sculptural detail on it, and then once that's all done we'll start looking at making moulds. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so please do subscribe if you're interested in keeping up with what's going on. You can also find out more on my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.